Welcome back to another video on Gearsaw Studios, and today I'm going to be giving a fact about every single Minecraft item. Very simple premise, it's going to take a while, and this is, well, at the time of recording, probably going to be a multi-part series. So without further ado, let's investigate what the details are. And 1, it's 1.21.5. I will not be talking about the dried gas or anything that comes out during that period. 2. For things that have variants, I'm only going to be talking about the base version unless there's something really interesting. For flowers, chances are I'm going to talk about them all as one, unless there's something actually interesting about them. For the logs, they're all one block. For the concretes, all one block. And they will be done in alphabetical order, which keeps it nice and concise. Starting off simple, we have the amethyst shard. And because it's a very, well, benign item, there isn't too much to say until you go to the ancient city. It's found in its loot tables to be expected. I mean, it's a random item. But then, once you listen to the 5 disc, you'll realize that it's probably some non-infested version of the Echo Shard, which is pretty interesting to say. Next up, the activator rail, and this one's pretty easy. The activator rail, contrary to most ideas about TNT minecarts, will actually not instantly detonate it. In fact, here's how it works. I have a detector rail here, then an activator here, and then activate it, push it over, and you can see it is now primed, which allows you to send this into a cavern. And then, of course, well, it blows up. Not much else to say. For the amethyst cluster, slightly out of order, well, there's a very interesting thing about its sounds compared to most amethyst. Because it comes in 4 variants, each one actually has slightly different sounds due to pitches. So here's the noises. The smallest one, the medium, and then the large, and the fully grown. Notice how they get louder and louder, which is, well, a nice little detail. You can technically use sound in order to determine which one you are standing on. Now for andesite, and I'm going to lump in the other 3 original decorative stones and their variants in here. On Java Edition, they do not have any properties with moss, but on Bedrock Edition, due to some various ID stuff, they can actually get overwritten by moss, which is a very niche mechanic, but hey, if you ever wanted to get rid of some polished andesite, you could definitely do it by bone mealing moss. Despite what conventional logic would suggest, an anvil is actually less damaging than a piece of pointed dripstone falling from the same height. For this example, you can see here, I'm about to get squished. And then, I take 4 hearts, then I regen it all, and then this was fatal. The apple, despite being a really normal item, strangely enough could drop from players named Notch, the original creator of Minecraft, upon death. Even if he didn't have one in his inventory, he would always drop an apple, which is a neat little detail. This has since been removed. The armadillo scoot actually has a completely different texture in its mob vote video. You can see here the one in game is a lot smaller and less armored than the one presented in the video, which I'm not entirely sure how they managed to get from point A to point B on that one. Since we're talking about Arrow the item instead of Arrow the entity, there's a bit less to say about it. However, on Bedrock Edition, pillagers can actually drop arrows, which is strangely absent from Java Edition. Which edition is right is actually completely unknown, and thus we might not know for a very long time. But hey, if it was added to Java, suddenly, well, it would be very easy to get arrows, as if 1 emerald for 16 of them wasn't broken enough. While most effects for tipped arrows are relatively consistent, 22 seconds for normal, 1 minute for extended, and 11 seconds for its empowered version, slowness is the exception, of course for balancing reasons. Slowness 4 is only applied for 2 seconds, which is very powerful but for a very short amount of time. Essentially, it's better used for stunning rather than actual slowing. If you're interested in that and disabling sprinting, then you'd probably be better off using the normal slowness arrow. Azaleas and their flowering variant, interestingly, are actually the only saplings with a solid hitbox, versus every single other one which behaves like grass. On Java Edition, this allows them to even have mobs to spawn on them, which means Bedrock Edition lush caves are probably less dangerous than their Java Edition counterparts. Baked potatoes, despite being a literal food item that's been cooked, somehow are better at composting than their raw variants. How that works, I'm not entirely sure, since there's less moisture in it now. Bamboo, despite being grass, actually cannot be composted. This is almost certainly because it would be absolutely broken, considering it grows on average 1 block every 200 seconds, which also means it's the fastest growing plant in the game. Out of all the wooden block sets, the bamboo block set is actually the largest one, mainly because not only does it already have a boat, it also has the mosaic block. Another thing is that the planks actually have a different texture compared to most other planks, which are recolors of each other. This one has little bands of bamboo in it. The banner patterns actually were missing one on Java Edition until they received their retextures in 1.21. And the one that was missing was the indented border. Originally, you could always use it in Java Edition, but for parity reasons, you now need a banner pattern in order to use it, just like in Bedrock Edition. Barrels, despite being a storage container, actually are not used to store any loot in any structure in the game, unlike chests, which are predominantly used for almost every single structure. Basalt, despite being the most obvious counterpart to stone in the Nether, considering how it generates in generators, cannot be used for stone tools. This is because blackstone was made instead in order to serve for that. On top of that, blackstone generates in all the biomes, versus basalt, which, likely at the time of blackstone being developed, was only found in the Soul Sand Valley before basalt deltas were made into a biome. Thus, they were already outclassed by the time they were implemented. Beacons, despite being a very endgame block dedicated for defeating the Wither and thus mainly used for large-scale excavation, actually had a second source for a time. They were originally used as an elytra inside the end ship. This is why there's some glass remaining on the end ship to this day, mainly because that's where the beacon was situated. However, that was quickly removed in favor of actually getting an elytra. Bee nests are actually completely renewable and actually quite farmable. If you plant a sapling within a few blocks of a flower, and preferably oak or birch, sometimes mangrove though, you can get a bee nest from it, which makes them renewable. And if it and its more industrial counterpart in the beehive are lit on fire, then all the bees get kicked out, which makes it an effective way to see how many bees you have if you're quick enough at putting out the fire. Beetroots are actually used for red dye, because in real life they're actually used for the exact same purpose. And you can actually see natural beet juice on some products if you read their ingredient list. They will likely be a lot more common since artificial dyes are being banned in the United States, and thus, well, it is an effective red dye, so you're likely to see a lot more of them in real life. As for the seeds generating in end cities, that was actually an accidental parity change. Legacy Console Edition did not have the necessary world size in order to support always having beetroots, and thus they added them to the end cities of all things. This in turn actually led to them getting added to Java Edition and later Bedrock Edition, which means it was a completely accidental change that mistakenly got added to everything. Beetroot soup, despite being unstackable and having a whole slew of not very useful attributes on it, is actually identical to eating cooked chicken. Along with that, it generates very specifically in one type of snowy village house at a rare chance, in case you are ever looking for the rarest natural thing. Of course, it's not actually the rarest, but still, it's an oddly specific thing. Since item metadata is still being used in Bedrock Edition because the flattening did not occur as one giant event, well, there is actually an interesting time where using certain commands on a bell would change its stone type to use things like granite, polished granite, and diorite. Along with that, the bells on Bedrock Edition deflect projectiles and have a ton of random properties that aren't present in their Java Edition counterparts. Big drip leaves actually can be powered by redstone to lock their state, in case you ever wanted to use them for more conventional parkour. If you power them, they won't fold down. For small drip leaves, since both of them are drip leaves despite being very different blocks, there's actually an issue with getting small drip leaves, because if you bone meal them, they'll just turn big, which makes them incredibly hard to get in large quantities, making them renewable only through the Wandering Trader. The in-universe explanation for why blackstone cannot be used for things like brewing stands and other weirder purposes is actually because it's too brittle, which says a few things about blackstone. Despite this, there are no properties in-game that actually suggest this, making this simply a weird recipe oddity. Blast furnaces actually have an extra use in specifically the PlayStation 4 Legacy Console Edition, which of course got the 1.14 update despite none of the other legacy consoles getting it. This purpose is actually the ability to smelt sand and red sand, which means it's actually the most useful on an edition where it really should not exist. The reason why blaze powder is ever used in the brewing stand was actually because they wanted to include one in the igloo for thematic reasons and to teach people how to actually cure a zombie villager. Of course, that would mean you could get potions before going to the nether, and they didn't really want that. Hence why you now need blaze powder to operate the brewing stand. Blaze rods have an interesting drop chance. Although they follow the normal rules of 0 to 1 and then increasing with looting, they can only drop if the blaze is killed by a player or some other player-caused source, which means you cannot automatically farm it without wolves, and good luck managing to get the wolves to attack it. The reason why this exists, I'm not actually sure about. However, it's certainly something you have to design around, and why your automatic blaze farm seems to do literally nothing. Now for all of the block of blank. Block of amethyst, only block to make a noise when hit with a projectile. Bamboo cannot be smelted into charcoal, but the normal coal is actually more efficient when compacted. However, because it smelts more than the amount of items you can fit into a furnace, it often gets wasted. Blocks of copper are quite blast resistant, and since they're often found in trial chambers, you can stone cut them into 4 pieces of cut copper. Of course, they're variant. And this means that you can bring a stack of these blocks readily sourced from your local trial chamber, cut them into 4 stacks, and then you can build yourself a decently blast resistant shelter in case you need to make something for a PvP battle upcoming. Blocks of diamond actually generate in woodland mansions inside secret rooms. And then blocks of emerald actually went through 5 iterations during the texture update for 1.14. Which is an exceedingly high amount for something that's really not that important in the grand scheme of things. Blocks of gold still generate in ocean monuments. We all know that, but considering the value of gold has dropped off massively, it means that going to an ocean monument is kind of a waste of time if you're going for the gold, because a ruined portal can give you 2 to 3. Then the block of iron actually has its own noises, which, well, is kind of odd, but yeah. It received them in the 1.21.5 update. To continue the endless war about lapis, lapis lazuli blocks actually only received that name in 1.17. Before then, they were called blocks of lapis, and internally they're known as a lapis block. So good luck, is lazuli part of the name or not? Despite conventionally being the hardest block in the game to get, blocks of netherite are not the rarest. That goes to the dragon egg, because only 1 dragon egg generates per world, assuming no glitches. Blocks of quartz, despite almost every other block being able to do so, cannot be split back into 4 pieces of quartz. This is because it only takes 4 pieces versus all the other blocks listed, which take 9 of their respective materials. Then for the blocks of raw materials, they cannot be smelted simply because it would kind of be broken. And also, how do you just refine that into a single block right then and there? Blocks of redstone, despite coming from a family of things that usually doesn't have a higher purpose, like the block of diamond really just being for beacons, emits a redstone signal. On top of that, they have funny interactions with pistons, which means they're one of the only material blocks with an actual use. The block of resin actually is instantly mineable. Not many people know that, but yes, it is completely instantly mineable. Going slightly out of order, the banner actually has different behavior depending on the edition when it comes to equipping it. On Bedrock Edition, if you want it on your head, it's a chest plate. However, in Java Edition, it has to be on your head to actually appear on your head. The reason for this inconsistency is questionable, but it certainly exists. Now for bones, well, 3 bones go into making a bone block, which is kind of weird, but technically 1 skeleton can make a bone block because of looting. Due to the existence of fossils, bone blocks actually were generating the moment they were added, or at least a few snapshots thereafter. Unlike most other blocks you'd expect to actually generate, well, they actually do the whole time. Then, for bone meal, you can't actually bone meal sugarcane in Java Edition, but you can in Bedrock Edition. Of course, it's a kind of OP thing in Bedrock Edition because you don't actually have to set up any farms. Books are actually a shapeless recipe. This means you can craft them in any shape you want. Thus, you cannot do anything to stop me from making my books like this. Then, if you add a book and quill to this, then you can actually see you can crash the game with it by inserting 64 stacks of these books containing very dense characters such as section characters or things like that. You can actually overload the game's data. However, this is kinda not allowed on servers and can soft lock you from your world. This is called chunk banning because this shulker box contains too much data for the game to handle, which is kind of funny. The bookshelf, due to villager curing, allows you to get infinite emeralds by breaking it apart and then selling each constituent piece for 3 emeralds, then buying it back for 1 emerald. This is also a very good way to get XP, and thus kind of invalidates the bottle O enchanting. Despite mostly being useless in the modern day, bottle O enchantings actually have a bit of a tumultuous history until getting replaced by Skulk. They actually went obtainable, then unobtainable, and back and forth a few times because they were only obtainable by villagers. When they were first added, the update that brought them made them creative mode exclusive. With a 0.8% chance, you can catch an enchanted bow from fishing, which is enchanted with level 30. This means you can potentially get mending on it because it also can have treasure enchantments. Keep this in mind if you're ever doing something for modded, because if there's something very rare that's a treasure enchantment from modded, potentially you could just fish up a bow with it. The bowl has a very interesting method of obtainment. This is because if a turtle dies by lightning, it will drop a bowl. Probably meant to represent its shell, but that's oddly specific. Good job at Mojang or something? And then going right to seas for a moment, because the list I'm using, coral, actually didn't have a dead variant for a while. Mainly the coral fans. If you stuck them out of water, they'd kind of just exist. And then 1.13.1 came along, and now they will die. Besides air, which is not an item, bread is one of the most common things to ever find in a loot table, appearing in 19 separate loot tables across several structures. Despite Breeze's visibly having only 4 rods versus the Blaze's 12, it actually drops more Breeze rods, with a default of 1 to 2 rather than 0 to 1. And just like the Blaze, it will only drop them if kill credit is given to the player or a tamed wolf. Despite what mining it would suggest, brewing stands will actually drop itself even when mined without a pickaxe. Despite being visibly a stony thing, yeah, it will give it to you. A strange logical consistency with the brick is that 3 of them will make a flower pot, visibly very small. However, 4 of them will make a decorated pot, which raises some questions about how big is a brick or how much is being lost when creating a flower pot. As for the actual bricks themselves, they have a bit of an interesting story. About that banner pattern I mentioned earlier, it is crafted with a brick block. I'm not entirely sure how smashing a piece of paper and a giant pile of bricks together somehow makes a picture of bricks. Beds have an interesting parity issue across all editions. On any edition that isn't Java, they have an individual item sprite. However, on Java, they render as their full 2-block form. The reason for this is also unknown. Of all the strangely niche interactions in the game, I think the bucket takes number 1. If you smelt a wet sponge and have a bucket inside the fuel slot, then you will actually get a water bucket out of it. I'm not entirely sure why this exists, but it's certainly a way in case he ever needed more water because he somehow made things go extinct. As for things that you can actually put in the bucket, well, axolotls, cod, pufferfish, salmon, tadpole, and tropical fish mostly have the same texture, except tadpoles, which will use mangrove water instead. Each one of these is also 1 pixel lower due to the weight of the animal inside. The bundle is the only item to ever get a description on how to use it, versus the various tooltips on swords, damage, and attack speed, and things like that. The bundles will actually teach you how to use them if you hover over them. Buried treasure maps are actually a bit of an exception when it comes to all the other maps that exist, because they're the only one that cannot be gotten by a villager. Every other type of explorer map can only be gotten by villagers. Bushes do not give seeds. The original texture of the cactus actually used oak logs as a base, and when they're originally added, trying to collect them would actually hurt you. And there's a whole bunch of weird oddities, such as the fact that they used to be able to be used as magma because they did not repel each other like they do now. You could make a whole floor out of them and kill anything that walked on it. Cactus flowers that come as a result will only grow if the cactus is not surrounded by other blocks. This is to make sure that cactus farms do not break when upgrading to the latest version. Of all the places that you could find cake, the trial chambers has a chance to generate with them. On Bedrock Edition, the buried treasure can also generate with a cake at a very low chance. Calcite, despite being a decorative stone added in the 1.17 update, ironically has no variants. Every other type of stone that was added had at least a polished variant introduced at some point, but calcite was left with nothing. The calibrated skulk sensor, on top of being able to hear only certain frequencies and have improved range, also can hear things faster. The delay on them hearing between things is actually shorter. You can put out campfires using a shovel, or you could also use splash potions of water. For a moment, candles were not actually meant to be included in 1.17, instead being added in 1.18. At the last minute, during one of the pre-releases, it was added back with different textures. Their function was pretty much unchanged though. In 1.8, during one of its early snapshots, carrots were actually nerfed by 25%, from 4 hunger shanks to 3, and their saturation with it from 4.8 to 3.6. The carrot on a stick is often used in one of the weirdest scenarios, because nobody actually rides pigs unironically, but the carrot on a stick still has right-click functionality, which means it can be used in order to make custom items and data packs. However, since the food rewrite, modern versions of data packs prefer to use a poisonous potato, and sometimes you can see the rabbit's foot being used instead. But of course, the rabbit's foot could actually be used in brewing, which means your magical staff of destruction might actually be turned into a potion if you aren't careful. The cartography table actually has vertical plank textures on its sides. It is not rotatable, which means you can't use this for building purposes unless you specifically build your build in a certain direction, but it's interesting that it exists nonetheless. Carved pumpkins actually did not exist for a very long time. This is because all pumpkins were initially carved. Sometimes you could even see the stem growing where its nose should be. Then, once they were added in 1.13, all the original pumpkins were automatically carved to make sure nothing broke. On Bedrock Edition, the cauldron actually can generate with a random potion, and this can have 1 to 2 uses. But at the same time, this can include wither, and if you use a bottle or arrows, because you can tip arrows into a cauldron on Bedrock Edition for very easy obtainability, you could get potions of decay in survival mode naturally. These potions don't actually exist on Java Edition. Although it's a mechanic us builders take for granted today, chains used to not actually be able to be oriented like logs, which means making a cool trolley cart was impossible. Chainmail armor, despite being rare and not as useful as iron, actually has a higher rarity at uncommon rather than everything else being common. Charcoal, despite being a relatively forgotten thing because how common coal is now, is still the most effective way to use wood in Java Edition, while in Bedrock Edition, you have a better time converting it into slabs instead of actually using charcoal. Thus, it's actually a completely useless item on Bedrock Edition if it weren't for them dropping from campfires. The cherry wood set has a strange abnormality. It has its own sounds. No other wood set besides bamboo, which is barely a wood, and the nether funguses actually have unique noises. When originally added, chests were a full block. Why? Okay, I guess nowadays they don't render from afar and they could use a full block texture then, but why? It's so cursed to look at. I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with it, but why? Now for the chiseled bookshelf. The chiseled bookshelf can actually have an advancement gained off of it if you use a comparator on it. Using a comparator on any other block does not do anything, which means not only is this an introduction for redstone, but also an oddly specific usage. Now for all the chiseled blocks right here. Chiseled copper just depicts an ordinary symbol. Then, chiseled deep slate seems to resemble a warden. Nether bricks resemble skulls, specifically the wither skull. And then, polished blackstone has a piglin snout. The quartz depicts an eye, and I'm not entirely sure why. And then, red sandstone has a wither on it. Resin, of course, depicts a creaking. Sandstone depicts a creeper, and chiseled stone bricks just has an ordinary pattern, which is actually off-centered. Chiseled tuff, well, what do you think it was? Yeah, it's the breeze. And chiseled tuff bricks are a strange abnormality in the block set, but are really cool to look at. I feel like they were made probably because two cool textures were made, and they didn't want to get rid of either one. The chorus flower can be destroyed by most projectiles, including the wind charge. Ironically, the wind charge cannot destroy end crystals because it was too easy. But since you can use it on chorus flowers, this means you'll actually have a pretty decent time collecting them nowadays. The chorus fruit, if you eat it midair, will drop you straight to the ground. This allows you to sneakily escape being chased if you're using an elytra, or as fall damage cancellation. Clay blocks are actually most commonly found in the lush cave nowadays. If you want to get a ton of them, go there. And for the clay ball, because let's be honest, these items are way too similar to actually come up with something else, you can go down there and mine all the clay and then turn it into clay balls and trade it with masons, which is a severely underrated method of getting emeralds, especially since masons are so useful. Clocks actually used to be a lot more precise. However, to make them consistent and not code generated, they have lost a ton of frames. And the same can be said about the compass. Both of these items also did not use the new gold or iron textures during 1.14, instead getting them at a later version like 1.17. The eye blossom actually gives different dyes depending on when it's used to craft. If it's closed, it will give you gray, but if it's open, it will give you orange. Hilariously, coal is renewable in Minecraft. This is because wither skeletons will drop it. This means coal is actually a more sustainable resource than almost any other thing in the game, because wither skeletons are so common to find in nether fortresses. Coarse dirt actually used to not have a unique texture. It was simply called grassless dirt, could not actually be collected because it would turn right back into normal dirt, and only generated in the windswept savanna. However, at a later update, since it already had a unique tile ID, it was turned into a block of its own. Cobbled deep slate actually used to not be the one with the wall variant. Originally, normal deep slate had a wall variant. It was removed shortly thereafter. Cobblestone takes longer to mine than stone. This means, when possible, don't make a cobblestone generator. make a stone generator. However, that involves making water source blocks, and thus cannot be used in Skyblock unless he got 2 waters. Cobwebs, despite being literal spider webs, or at least what the game suggests are spider webs, are harder than deep slate. However, you can mine them with your hand, or if you use shears or a sword, you can mine them very quickly. When cocoa beans were originally added, they're actually called cocoa beans, and not like the chocolate, but like the movie. This was corrected very quickly afterwards. Until 1.15, Java Edition had a very evil recipe for composters, involving fences. Fortunately, it was changed to a bunch of slabs that leave you with 1 behind, or 5 behind depending on what you're doing, and just to leave you sad. Conduits actually can damage mobs. Unlike the beacon, it will deal some amount of damage to anything touching water or rain nearby. However, this only applies to hostiles. But what it considers hostile is kind of funny because on Bedrock Edition, this will also include skeleton horses and zombie horses. I have a feeling one of y'all has lost a skeleton horse to this, or perhaps I have solved a lifelong mystery for you. Going through all the cooked meats right one after another, we have cooked chicken. Its raw variant actually has a chance of giving you hunger, mainly because food poisoning from chicken is decently common. Strangely enough, this does not apply to pork. Pork chops will actually give you food poisoning very easy in real life, hence why they're actually considered unclean in some religions. Then, for cooked cod, they were originally just called cooked fish. However, they were changed to become cod when 1.13 came out. Mutton actually has a fan-made texture. It was posted on Reddit one day when the original texture was shown, and it was later added into the game. This was not changed during the texture update. On Java Edition, rabbits actually have a guaranteed 1 raw rabbit drop chance. On Bedrock Edition, this is a bit more inconsistent at 0 to 1. Concrete can actually be instantly mined on Bedrock Edition, hence why you don't see TNT dupers or concrete farms existing on that edition. This is because haste is 5% faster on Bedrock. In Java Edition, feeding a parrot a cookie will instantly kill it. On Bedrock Edition though, it will instead get 16 minutes and 40 seconds. Yeah, very specific number because it's easily divisible. And then it will just die of a new effect called Fatal Poison. It is virtually identical to poison, except it will be fatal, and it cannot be cured through honey bottles or any similar means. Copper bulbs used to not operate on redstone ticks, instead normal ticks, which made computers in Minecraft very effective. However, this was undone because of a consistency reason inside Mojang, despite it being intended design originally. It is unknown why consistency took precedence over this. Copper doors are immune to mobs. They will not be broken down by zombies. Also, their existence is interesting, mainly because copper doors, well, where's the gold doors? However, iron doors exist and have vastly different behavior. Trapdoors for these also exist, with similar effects. Copper ingots can be dropped by drowned, at an increased chance versus the other mobs that can drop ingots, like zombies and zombie pigmen. Originally, drowned also dropped gold ingots. Prior to the addition of the cornflower, the only way to get blue dye was actually lapis, which meant if you wanted to have nice blue things but were short on lapis, well, I guess you're not enchanting. This meant that old editions actually made blue the most valuable color. Nowadays, because of the existence of the cornflower, all the dyes are roughly the same, except with red and yellow being a lot easier to get. The crafter actually was originally hinted at during the voting update. There was an actual item called the crafter, and alongside it there was an item that would automatically mine blocks. The latter was not implemented, but the crafter was. Crafting tables can only generate in certain village types. They can never be found in a plains village, but they can be found in savanna, desert, and taiga villages. Along with that, they can be found in other structures like witch huts, igloos, trail ruins, pillager outposts, and in a secret room inside the trial chambers. The Creaking Heart, like the Skulk Shriekers, actually has a different data state depending on whether it was placed or naturally generated. The Creaking Heart will give XP if it was naturally generated, or it will only give some resin otherwise. The creeper head actually is used for fireworks. That's how you get the firework that looks like a creeper. I mean, what did you expect? Because I missed it earlier, the buttons. It turns out that wooden buttons, of course, they can be hit down with arrows while stone ones can't, but they're also pressed down for longer, 50% longer actually. Crossbows are actually significantly stronger on Bedrock Edition than they are on Java. This is because their damage and velocity is consistent. Because arrow damage is based on velocity, bows with power actually shoot arrows farther. But crossbows will always do it the same on Bedrock, dealing 9 damage every time, versus in Java where they can go over or under by a quite significant margin that hurts their viability. Crying Obsidian actually has a programmer art texture, because it was originally used for beds. However, once the bed got added, the Crying Obsidian got booted from the game, and then it was added back at a much later date in the Nether update. In 1.13, concrete powder actually was capable of becoming concrete when in contact not just with water, but with lava. Yeah, it's a kind of odd mechanic, but it was a bug and thus shortly thereafter got patched out. Carpets actually can be stacked repeatedly, and although they cannot float, when they're stacked, they're considered not there for pathfinding purposes, which means if you put 4 or 5 of them stacked in front of your base doors, mobs will have a much harder time walking into your base. However, they'll have an easier time if they're actively targeting you, although they'll spin around on each individual block first. Well, that was every block A through C done. Not exactly in alphabetical order, but it's still a pretty good amount, and considering the amount of blocks that are named A through C in the game, the other episodes might cover more letters. Either way, enjoy the rest of your day. Gearsaw out.